April 12, 1935, Cavendish Laboratory, Cambridge. The room smelled of ozone and hot metal. A low hum vibrated through the air, a sound almost like a mechanical heartbeat. Sparks jumped from a strange, glass-encased contraption on the bench, a device that looked more like a piece of futuristic jewelry than a serious scientific instrument. Percy Spencer, a young physicist in his late 20s, leaned in, eyes wide behind thick spectacles, hands trembling slightly with anticipation. "You're sure it'll generate enough power?" his colleague asked, voice tight with equal parts skepticism and awe. The laboratory was cramped, walls lined with shelves of wires, copper coils, and scattered papers filled with arcane formulas. A single fan struggled against the stifling heat, whirring in protest. Spencer adjusted the dials of the magnetron, a sleek cylindrical tube that glowed faintly when electricity coursed through it. He didn't answer immediately. He was staring at a chocolate bar tucked in his coat pocket. A small flash of curiosity danced across his face as he held it near the magnetron. The hum deepened, the air vibrated. Suddenly, the chocolate bar began to sweat, then melted, dripping onto his palm. Spencer's jaw dropped. He pulled back instinctively. Around him, the lab fell silent, save for the persistent hum. That's impossible," he whispered. The room seemed to shrink around him. Sparks crackled again, a tiny arc jumping across the metal workbench. Spencer's colleagues stared, unsure whether to laugh, panic, or call the fire brigade. But Spencer's mind had already leapt far beyond melted chocolate. In his imagination, he could see it. Invisible waves slicing through walls, bouncing off objects, revealing the unseen. A strange, thrilling notion began to form, a weapon, not of bullets or bombs, but of energy that could detect the unseen, the hidden movements of men and machines. In the months that followed, the magnetron, a product of wartime radar research yet still considered an esoteric curiosity, became the focal point of Spencer's obsession. He spent long nights sketching diagrams, tweaking circuits, jotting down notes that were often illegible to anyone but himself. The lab smelled perpetually of burnt wires and coffee, his hair unkempt, sleeves scorched with tiny burns from experiments gone awry. By 1937, the idea had matured. Spencer proposed a radical notion. Microwaves could be used not just to cook or melt chocolate, but to detect distant objects, aircraft cruising hundreds of miles away, invisible to the naked eye. In England, the threat of war loomed. German Luftwaffe planes could appear out of nowhere, dropping bombs on cities that had no warning systems to defend themselves. Spencer's crazy idea now had a deadly seriousness attached to it. The concept was simple in theory, but devilishly complex in practice. A microwave transmitter could send bursts of energy through the air. A receiver positioned elsewhere could catch the reflected waves from distant objects. The timing of the echo, Spencer reasoned, could reveal both distance and speed. It was like teaching the air itself to see. But every prototype failed initially. Waves scattered, circuits burned out, and experiments ended in clouds of smoke and sparks. Yet each failure refined the vision, sharpened the resolve. Late one night, Spencer's persistence paid off. A crude radar setup in a small camouflaged shed on the outskirts of Cambridge finally registered a small, distant aircraft. The blip on the screen, faint but unmistakable, sent a thrill through the room. This was no longer theoretical. The invisible could be made visible. The war, which had seemed distant and abstract, suddenly had a new battlefield, the very waves of the electromagnetic spectrum. And so began the secret war within the labs, a quiet, invisible struggle of scientists racing against time, driven by sparks, melted chocolate, and one man's relentless curiosity. It was the first step toward an invention that would not only change warfare forever, but would also transform the mundane into the miraculous, turning microwaves into a tool capable of revealing the unseen. Enemy. November 3, 1937, a foggy morning cloaked the outskirts of Cambridge in a gray haze. Percy Spencer and a small team of engineers, including the meticulous Robert Watson Watt, shuffled across the dew-soaked grass toward a corrugated iron shed that smelled of solder, oil, and damp earth. Inside, the prototype radar equipment sat like a mechanical leviathan. Copper tubes, blinking indicators, rotating antennas, and wires snaking across the floor in a chaotic tangle. Spencer's hands moved with a mix of reverence and urgency. "If this work," he muttered, barely audible over the whir of the magnetron, "we'll know where the planes are before anyone sees them." Watson Watt adjusted the receiver, peering at the oscillograph, a thin line of phosphorescent light flickering across the screen. Outside, a Hawker Hart biplane rumbled through the mist, its engine a low growl beneath the tension of the team. Spencer flicked a switch. The magnetron vibrated, sending a pulse into the cold morning air. On the screen, the faintest blip appeared. The men held their breath. The aircraft's movement, invisible to the naked eye in the fog, now traced a ghostly arc across the screen. "There!" Watson Watt exclaimed, tapping the glass. "It's alive!" The exhilaration was immediate but tempered with the realization of the stakes. Germany's Luftwaffe was expanding, and Britain had almost no early warning system to counter potential attacks. This fragile prototype, a Frankenstein's monster of copper and sparks, could be the difference between thousands of lives saved or lost. Over the following months, the team refined the system, experimenting with pulse lengths, antenna angles, and receiver sensitivity. Each adjustment was painstaking, often requiring long nights spent hunched over oscillographs in near darkness, listening to the soft hum of machinery. By 1938, the tests moved beyond controlled airspace. The team began simulating potential attacks on London, tracking increasingly faster aircraft at greater distances. Every success brought confidence. Every failure, lessons. The radar signals were subtle, almost ghost-like in the static, yet persistent. It became clear that the magnetron, this unassuming device once associated with melted chocolate, had the power to reveal the invisible. Meanwhile, the political tension across Europe escalated. In Germany, aircraft production surged, and the threat of aerial bombardment on British soil grew imminent. Intelligence reports predicted a new kind of warfare, one that would strike without warning, overwhelming cities and military installations alike. The British government, once skeptical, now funneled resources into Spencer and Watson Watt's research. Labs expanded, engineers multiplied, and the quiet, obsessive work in sheds and makeshift facilities became a top-secret race against time. On a cold night in January 1939, the team conducted a pivotal trial. A single bomber flying at 8,000 feet over the countryside passed through the radar's scanning beam. The blip appeared with uncanny clarity. Spencer's hand trembled as he scribbled the readings into his notebook. "We can see them," he whispered, eyes reflecting the soft glow of the screen. "We can really see them." These successes laid the groundwork for what would soon be called the Chain-Home Radar Network, a series of stations stretching across Britain's coast, designed to give early warnings of incoming enemy aircraft. The idea that began with a melted chocolate bar and a curious spark had evolved into a strategic lifeline. It was no longer a laboratory curiosity. It was the invisible shield Britain desperately needed. By mid-1939, Spencer's once crazy idea had become a national secret, guarded fiercely, whispered about only among scientists, engineers, and military planners. The laboratory's hum had grown louder, more purposeful, a heartbeat of a nation racing to protect itself from the looming storm of war. August 23, 1939. The air over southern England was thick with the scent of rain and tension. Inside a nondescript brick building near Bawdsey Manor, engineers and military officers bustled past one another, papers clutched in hands, voices hushed but urgent. Percy Spencer, now a key figure in the fledgling radar program, moved through the room with the quiet focus of a man who had lived inside a world of sparks and oscilloscopes for years. The stakes had changed. With Germany's invasion of Poland imminent, the British government knew that the threat of air attack was no longer theoretical. The magnetron and the experiments it had inspired were no longer curiosities. They were weapons of survival. Chain-home radar stations, still under construction along the eastern and southern coasts, were to form Britain's first line of defense, capable of detecting aircraft hundreds of miles away. Spencer walked past a young radar operator, Lieutenant George Chapman, who was struggling to interpret the flickering lines on the cathode ray tube. "Steady, Chapman," Spencer said, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Remember, each blip is a life, each echo is a warning." Chapman nodded, sweat beading on his forehead as he fine-tuned the receiver. Outside, the wind howled through the antennas perched on tall masts, rocking them in the gray dawn. Over the next few weeks, testing intensified. Engineers climbed steel ladders to adjust transmitter arrays, recalibrating frequencies to cut through static and atmospheric interference. Every morning brought a new problem: interference from weather, misaligned antennas, and occasionally equipment failures that sent sparks flying and alarms blaring. Spencer's face, usually calm, now carried a permanent edge of fatigue, but his mind raced, thinking through every scenario in which the enemy might strike, and how his team could stop them before bombs rained down on cities. On September 3, 1939, Britain declared war on Germany. The quiet hum of laboratory equipment had transformed into a national drumbeat. Chain-home radar stations became operational in key coastal regions, each transmitting pulses into the sky, scanning for aircraft at unimaginable distances. Operators, some barely out of training, stared intently at the screens, their nerves taut. And then it happened. The first real test under wartime conditions. A formation of German reconnaissance planes flying low over the North Sea appeared on multiple radar screens. Blips glimmered, faint but unmistakable, tracing the aircraft's path as they approached British airspace. Alarm bells rang, operators shouted coordinates, and fighter command scrambled Spitfires to intercept. For the first time, the invisible enemy became visible, and the nation's defense system, built on the crazy idea of microwaves bouncing off distant objects, worked as intended. Spencer watched from a command room, the tension in his chest both unbearable and exhilarating. Each pulse from the magnetron carried not just energy but potential salvation. The technology, once a laboratory experiment, had matured into a decisive tool. Radar operators across the country were now the eyes of Britain, seeing enemy aircraft long before they arrived, buying precious minutes that could save lives in cities. By the end of 1939, the chain-home network had expanded, linking dozens of stations along the coastline. Each new station meant greater coverage, faster detection, and higher chances of intercepting enemy raids. The once crazy idea of a chocolate-melting physicist had grown into an invisible web of national defense, a force multiplier for the Royal Air Force. And for Spencer, Watson Watt and their teams, the work was far from over. The war had just begun, and the stakes were higher than ever. July 10, 1940. The skies above southern England were a restless gray, churned by the summer winds of what would soon be remembered as the Battle of Britain. Inside a cramped radar operations room near Dover, Sergeant Elsie MacDonald hunched over a glowing cathode ray tube, her eyes darting along the flickering lines. Sweat dripped down her brow beneath the cap of her uniform. Every pulse of the magnetron carried a message, friend or foe. Every tiny blip was a potential threat or salvation. Outside, a formation of German Junkers U-87 Stukas tore across the coastline, engines screaming, bombs primed. But inside the operations room, the enemy was already known. The chain-home radar had tracked the approaching aircraft from over 80 miles away. The officers in the room, including Group Captain Keith Park, coordinated the interception, voices clipped and precise over the crackling radio. Fighter squadrons scrambled from nearby airfields, Spitfires and Hurricanes climbing into the sky to meet the bombers before they could reach London. Percy Spencer, now a consultant for the Air Ministry, observed quietly from a corner, clipboard in hand. His hands, once covered in soot from laboratory experiments, were now steady, holding the notes that mapped radar coverage, aircraft positions, and response times. He could see the fruits of years of relentless experimentation unfolding in real time. A small smile tugged at his lips despite the tension. The invisible technology that once melted chocolate was now literally saving lives. The night was punctuated by the rhythmic hum and pulse of radar sets. Each echo carried information: speed, distance, altitude. Operators like Sergeant MacDonald became acutely attuned to the subtle variations in the blips, tiny differences. That could mean the difference between intercepting an enemy squadron and letting bombs fall unopposed. When a cluster of aircraft changed direction unexpectedly, alarms shrieked and Spitfires were vectored to meet them. Meanwhile, in London, air raid sirens began to wail, but thanks to the early warning provided by radar, citizens had precious minutes to reach shelters. Down the coast, anti-aircraft batteries adjusted their targeting based on the radar data feeding into command posts. It was a choreography of precision and timing, an invisible dance directed by microwaves bouncing off enemy aircraft hundreds of miles away. By the end of that day, the RAF had successfully intercepted multiple waves of German bombers. turning back attacks that might have devastated critical infrastructure. The success of radar in guiding defensive operations was undeniable. Military strategists now referred to it not as an experimental tool, but as the nation's secret weapon, a silent guardian against the storm of war. But the victories came at a cost. Operators endured long, exhausting shifts, often working in near darkness to avoid giving away the positions of the radar stations. Equipment frequently malfunctioned under the strain, and engineers had to perform rapid repairs, sometimes climbing the tall steel masts in the middle of the night, rain lashing their faces, all while enemy aircraft roared overhead. Yet the work continued. Every success reinforced the realization that one scientist's curiosity, one chocolate bar experiment in a Cambridge lab had transformed into a critical element of national survival. By late 1940, the chain home network had grown denser, covering nearly the entire southern and eastern coastlines. Radar was no longer just a technology. It was a symbol of resilience, a testament to ingenuity, and an essential component in the fight against the Luftwaffe. And for Spencer, Watson, Watt, and their team, the challenge was far from over. As the war expanded, so too would the need to detect faster, higher-flying aircraft over greater distances, pushing the boundaries of microwave science even further. March 15, 1941. A bitter wind cut across the cliffs near Dover, carrying the briny tang of the channel and a low rumble of distant aircraft engines. Inside a reinforced operations bunker, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Tizard reviewed a map of radar coverage, tapping at key sectors with a gloved finger. Chain home had been revolutionary, but the war was evolving. The Luftwaffe had begun deploying faster Messerschmitt fighters and long-range bombers, and the existing radar systems struggled to detect them at extreme distances. Percy Spencer, now working alongside British engineers and mathematicians in a sprawling, makeshift lab behind the front lines of radar development, studied the latest magnetron modifications. The new cavity magnetron, capable of generating unprecedented microwave frequencies, was their ticket to sharper, more precise detection. Equipment that had once been bulky and temperamental was shrinking, becoming more reliable and mobile, perfect for deployment on ships, airplanes, and even field stations. Spencer adjusted a prototype, hands deft despite the chill in the lab. Sparks leapt occasionally from the connections, but he barely flinched. Around him, assistants scurried, soldering wires, aligning waveguides, and running pulse tests. Every hum of the magnetron was a heartbeat in the race against time. "We need to see them before they see us," Spencer muttered, eyes locked on the oscillograph. Each new experiment pushed the radar's reach further, allowing operators to detect aircraft at previously unimaginable ranges. The wartime urgency was palpable. Intelligence reports indicated that German bombers were experimenting with night raids, a tactic designed to bypass radar detection. Spencer's team responded with ingenuity. Higher frequencies allowed smaller antennas which could be deployed more discreetly. Specialized operators trained to interpret faint echoes in static, creating a network of listening posts that spanned the nation. The invisible shield around Britain was becoming denser and more versatile. In April, a key test took place over the North Sea. A single bomber, flying at 15,000 feet in near-total darkness, passed through the radar scanning field. The blip appeared instantly on the operator's screens, its path precisely mapped. Fighter squadrons were vectored with pinpoint accuracy, and the aircraft was intercepted well before reaching the British coastline. Spencer, watching from the control center, felt a surge of triumph. The magnetron, once a laboratory curiosity that melted chocolate, had evolved into a lethal eye in the sky. Meanwhile, Allied engineers began adapting microwave technology for other military applications. Shipborne radar enabled detection of U-boats lurking beneath the waves. Airborne radar guided night fighter squadrons across enemy territory. Ground-based radar tracked artillery fire with unprecedented accuracy. Every innovation relied on the fundamental principle that Spencer had stumbled upon years earlier. Microwaves could reveal the invisible, turning a theoretical experiment into a practical, life-saving tool. By mid-1942, radar had transformed from an experimental lab project into a multifaceted instrument of war. The British defensive strategy now revolved around it. Enemy aircraft, once able to strike under the cloak of night or weather, were increasingly vulnerable to detection. The once crazy idea of one man fueled by curiosity and chance had become a cornerstone of Allied military power. Yet Spencer and his colleagues knew that the war was far from over. Each new day demanded refinement, adaptation and innovation under pressure, a relentless push to ensure that every blip on a screen translated into a tactical advantage. August 15, 1943. The air above the English Channel shimmered with heat and anticipation as waves of Allied bombers prepared for a coordinated strike on occupied France. Inside a radar operations room perched atop a cliff near Dover, Sergeant Elsie MacDonald adjusted the receiver, her eyes scanning the phosphorescent blips dancing across the screen. Each pulse of the magnetron carried a story: approaching formations, changing altitudes, enemy aircraft moving stealthily toward their targets. Percy Spencer stood quietly in the corner, now older, his hair graying at the temples, but his gaze as sharp as the first day he had seen chocolate melt under a microwave's invisible force. He watched the operators, the men and women whose lives were intertwined with the pulses and echoes, and felt a quiet pride. The instrument he had helped pioneer, once dismissed as a whimsical experiment, was now a linchpin in the Allies' ability to see and strike with precision. From the coastal cliffs to secret naval outposts, radar had reshaped warfare. The Luftwaffe, once able to surprise Britain with devastating raids, now faced an enemy that could see them before they crossed the horizon. Night after night, Spitfires and Hurricanes scrambled, guided by invisible waves, while anti-aircraft batteries adjusted their fire based on real-time data. The magnetron and the emerging radar networks had given the Allies a vision the enemy could not comprehend: the power to detect, respond, and defend with preemptive intelligence. But the significance went beyond immediate tactical advantage. Radar technology accelerated the pace of scientific innovation and military strategy. Spencer's laboratory experiments, born from curiosity, sparks, and a single chocolate bar, had led to cavity magnetrons capable of guiding everything from ships to missiles. The war, which had begun as a brutal contest of aircraft and artillery, now included an unseen battle of waves, pulses, and detection that gave the Allies an edge invisible to the naked eye. As dusk settled over Dover, the operators monitored the radar screens one last time. Enemy aircraft that had attempted to evade detection were either intercepted or diverted. A cheer echoed through the operations room, tempered by exhaustion and relief. Outside, the channel reflected streaks of red and gold from the setting sun, as if acknowledging the invisible war waged above and below the waves. Spencer walked out into the evening air, feeling the wind against his face. He remembered the spark in the lab, the chocolate bar, the countless nights spent soldering circuits and tuning antennas. What had seemed like a whimsical curiosity had become a decisive instrument of national survival. One scientist's crazy idea had changed the course of the war, giving Britain the eyes to see before the bombs fell. The war would continue for years, and radar would evolve further, shaping post-war aviation, navigation, and even the future of technology in ways Spencer had only begun to imagine. Yet the core truth remained: innovation often starts in small, unexpected moments, and sometimes a melted chocolate bar can become the seed of a secret weapon capable of altering the fate of nations.